Alrighty then. I do believe we are recording. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 148. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And you may be thinking, whoa, he looks like he's wearing a tailor-made Lithuanian linen robe. And those of you who caught that are very perceptive, because I finally got this custom-made Lithuanian linen robe. And I almost didn't get it because the postal service is very unreliable in this area and it got delivered to the wrong house. But the honest neighbors brought me my robe, and so I'm wearing it. In fact, I slept in it last night. I haven't changed clothes, haven't washed. And partly that's because I'm doing this late. I'm doing this on a Sunday early afternoon instead of a Saturday evening, which is generally the way I've been doing it. But my woman had other plans for last night, which postponed this Q&A until now. And I don't know how to pronounce the name of the place that makes these 100% linen, which is flax, which is actually allowable for monks' robes according to Vinaya. It's V-A-D-U. How do you pronounce Vadu or Wadu or something in Lithuanian? I don't know. But it is kind of interesting that in the Pali English dictionary, which is back there on the bookcase, like that big blue one right in the middle there, that there's a lot of etymologies for Pali words, and the most similar language to Pali, aside from Sanskrit, of course, that is used in the etymologies is Lithuanian. Lithuanian comes very close to Indian language or Indic languages. So anyways, before I start answering questions, I should point out that, of course, 148 is not a prime number. It is, in fact, 2 times 2 times 37, which is very vaguely auspicious because 37 has always been one of my favorite numbers. Well, it has been one of my favorite numbers, probably not always, but at some point in my youth, it became one of my favorite numbers, partly because it's prime. Also, I was 37 years old at the year 2000. This is my beverage. So, I suppose I should start answering questions because I got other stuff to do today. I got to go out in the backyard and put in an installment on digging the fish pond. Also, I gotta fix the sprinkler pipe that was underground that I accidentally broke when I was digging the fish pond. And so we got kind of a controversial one right off the bat here. This is from Philalethes. And Philalethes, this is it's a question and a screed kind of at the same time. It's a very long kind of essay that isn't really the question, but it has so much that, I could respond to that I'm probably going to read the whole thing just so I can kind of respond to it. But the first part here is got the actual question in it. It's, Darwin did not come up with natural selection. I know you didn't say this, but the questioner implied it. People have known about natural selection since prehistory because it's just common sense. Darwin came up with the theory of evolution of species by natural selection, which also was not a rare idea, but has been dismissed by natural philosophers since the time of the Greeks as too reductive. As someone who's iffy about the idea that species evolve at all, I would like to hear your take on why you think they do. And so that's the question. There's a question mark at the end of that last word there, do. But he's got like this long essay of sort of commentary following this. And so before I answer the question, I suppose I should just kind of wade into this just because it's something I know something about. Like, for example, I took a class, a 400 level class in Principles of Organic Evolution as a biology student in college. And the final exam was one question: give the evidence for evolution. And I sat there and just wrote for 2 hours straight until I ran out of time. Of course, it's not as fresh in my memory now, a lot of it. So I'll just give some of the main points. But let's just continue with this little essay here. There seems to be, frankly, zero archaeological evidence of evolution of species to this day. That is, one species morphing into another. Okay, let's just stop here. It's called a chronospecies. Just look up on the internet lists of chronospecies. A chronospecies is a species that was one species and then gradually morphed or evolved into another species. In fact, we are a chronospecies. I mean, you follow the fossil record. You've got like Homo erectus, and then Homo erectus kind of transforms into Homo heidelbergensis, and then Homo heidelbergensis kind of transforms into like archaic Homo sapiens. And they might be adding new ones in between because that's what some taxonomists do. So, frankly, zero archaeological evidence. Look up chronospecies and read what it says, because this is just a false statement. In fact, I would guess a lot of this stuff that Philalethes is coming up with is coming up, it's coming from like young earth creationists. Like, you've got some scientists who are, for the most part, real scientists who nevertheless are devout Christians, and they've got an axe to grind. They want to prove that the book of Genesis is the literal truth. That's how they start. You know, they're not starting with like a hypothesis and then trying to prove or disprove the hypothesis. It's like the Bible's true, and so we got to just do everything we can to find any kind of evidence in favor of young earth creationism and debunk any kind of evidence that is in favor of an earth that's billions of years old, where species have evolved gradually. So, let's see. So to me, Darwinism, not natural selection, but evolution by natural selection, is a pseudo-religion. No, it's not a religion at all, unless you're cultish about it. But if you just accept it as a scientific theory, the way someone would accept relativity, for example, or certain aspects of quantum mechanics, or that kind of thing, or Newtonian physics before Einstein came along, it's not necessarily a religion, much less, or a pseudo-religion. It just depends on if you're cultish about it or not. But if you accept it as a fairly obvious scientific explanation that is a solid theory, not necessarily gospel truth, but the evidence indicates it, you can forget the pseudo-religion stuff. So let's see here. What Darwin actually did is apply the new and hot science of English economics, market theory, to biology. This is known, look it up. And it is true that Darwin's theory of evolution was partly inspired by an essay by Thomas Malthus, who was more of an economist than a biologist, although I think he was also like an Anglican vicar or some such thing. And Thomas Malthus had this idea that wasn't really an economic idea, although it could be applied to economics as well as to biology, that organisms, including human organisms, have more children than can survive. Or, you know, it's just that populations are just going to like take off if they do not have positive checks. And Malthus, being Christian, had the positive checks being the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, especially the first 3. So it's like war, starvation, and disease. If humans do not keep their population in check through other means, then war, starvation, and disease will keep the population in check for us, which is the natural way. And aside from that, I'm not sure how market theory or like Adam Smith's economic theories really were like really significant in Darwin's theory. But Darwin did take this Malthusian idea that species produce more children than can survive in the long run, or they just produce an excess of children, going with the idea, this natural built-in idea that they're not all going to survive. And then he just added, well, the ones that do survive are more likely to be more adapted to the environment. And if you just continue this over time, it's going to result in like continued adaptations to the environment. And the environment can change. So it's not just getting closer and closer to perfection, because the environment is changing for various reasons, climate and introduced species and all sorts of things. So you're never going to catch up. You're never going to be perfectly adapted. Anyways, let's see here. More holistic philosophies that have a complete view of man have always denied this mechanistic, materialistic interpretation of the human being. Even now, there are more advanced theories on how human beings operate, such as most schools of yoga, including especially Vedanta. And I mean, Vedanta and almost all of these theories were pre-Darwinian. I mean, they hadn't thought of gradual evolution of species. There were a few, like, I think his name was Anaximander. He was one of the really early Greek philosophers who came up with the idea that humans somehow are descended from fish. But aside from that, I mean, it wasn't really talking about much. It's not mentioned at all. Like any kind of evolution really is not mentioned at all, like in any ancient Indian text that I have read. Marx was pre-Darwinian, which is one reason why he gets human nature so wrong, how he just fails to understand human nature. So let's see here. Shows this small-minded thinking of what life is. Well, I mean, it's not, evolution isn't trying to describe what life is. It's simply trying to describe why the forms of life that exist now, I mean, how they became this way, how they got here. And Darwin really just, he delivered this massive blow to Christian creationists, because before Darwin came along, they didn't really have any kind of scientific theory that really could be acceptable, that was considered to be in harmony with the evidence that was available. And so they're saying, well, God created us. I mean, you can come up with all your science that you please. Still, God created us. God created all of nature the way it is. And then Darwin came along and just pretty much shredded that. And I mean, there have been Christians who have been just yowling like scalded cats ever since. And some of these Christian theories, like from the Creationism Institute and so forth, it kind of trickles out into the mainstream, so that people who aren't young earth creationists, they see this stuff and they go, oh, that's interesting. When really a lot of it, most of it, is Christian creationists trying to champion like a literal interpretation of Genesis. So, okay, so let's just continue here. We would simply not have such a staggering variety of forms, but only a biomass that's converging into one specific ant-like creature. And this statement in particular is just utterly ignorant of biology. According to him, all right, we would simply not have such a staggering variety of forms, only a biomass converging into one specific ant-like creature. And this one specific ant-like creature, presumably, would live in all possible environments. It would fill in all possible ecological niches. It would eat all possible kinds of food. It would fly, crawl on the ground, and swim in fresh water and the ocean. And it just doesn't work that way. I mean, that statement is just a blatantly false statement. That if evolution is just left to itself, it's all going to be evolving towards this one ant-like creature. No, because that one ant-like creature isn't going to do all possible things that life can do. It's not going to eat all possible foods. It's not going to burrow underground and live on top of the ground and fly in the sky and climb trees and swim in the ocean and swim in fresh water. Reality doesn't work that way. Not even empirical reality. So, okay, mutation theory is even more unfeasible, but it's too long to get into. That's good. This is long enough as it is. So, by the way, the probability of getting 250 average length proteins by chance is 1 in 10 to the 41,000th power, whereas the number of possible particle interactions since the beginning of the universe is liberally estimated to be 10 to 139th power. And this is just parroting information he found somewhere. And I think that he's even like misparroting it, because the probability of getting 250 average length proteins by chance, I mean, could that really mean, maybe that means like one protein that is a chain of 250 amino acids, like a functional protein, 250 amino acids long, because proteins are a polymer of amino acids. So maybe that's what the actual statement is supposed to be, but it doesn't necessarily have to work that way. Let's see here. I mean, I was discussing, I can't remember if it was on a Q&A or somewhere else, where, I mean, the first proto-life would be a very simple protein, like a chain of amino acids that just replicates itself. It's like an enzyme that catalyzes the production of itself. And that would be the first proto-life. I'm not exactly sure what the mechanisms would be. There's different theories on how, like, radiation and lightning in like the Hadean atmosphere of the early Earth with no free oxygen. I mean, they've done experiments where you just take what is considered to be probably what the early atmosphere was like volcanic gases, a lot of methane and ammonia, water vapor, of course, no free oxygen at all, some sulfuric acid and so forth. And then you just run electricity through that, zap electricity through it, and spontaneously simple organic molecules start arising. And of course, the theory is from like the naysayers that, I mean, that same random electricity is going to be breaking them apart too. I mean, you can't just keep it. It doesn't just work in one direction where it just builds more and more and more complex molecules. So then you've got some scientists saying, well, you've got like it's happening in like ponds and so forth with mud, and then some of the molecules are getting down into the mud where other processes are kind of helping to link them together, that sort of thing. I don't think they've ever completely figured out how the first self-reproducing protein arose, but considering that it did arise, apparently, somehow or other, and you want to get rid of just the magic stuff, you know, Jehovah God did it, that kind of thing, then, I mean, it's not whether it happened, it's how it happened. But I'll get to that when I actually start answering the question instead of addressing this kind of screed. This alone proves how silly mechanistic science is. And I mean, some mechanistic science works really good. Isaac Newton was no slouch, really. I mean, his theories have pretty much been superseded, although most of his theories still work. You know, like the whole thing about the inverse squared law and that kind of thing is still solid science. And it does describe what empirical scientists are observing. You know, you come up with a mathematical equation that fits onto some observed phenomenon. Well, there you go. You come up with a kind of scientific theory or scientific model. So let's see here. And by now, even radiometric dating is known to not work except for carbon dating, which is useless beyond 8,000 years and unsound anywhere that has been flooded, aka everywhere humans live. So Phil Lathes here is saying all dating methods are bullshit. And this is what the Jehovah's Witnesses say. I mean, I first came across this idea in Jehovah's Witness literature. In fact, I've come across a lot of this stuff in Jehovah's Witness literature because, of course, they believe literal translation of the Bible and all that. So all dating methods are just completely unsound, and all the scientists are just faking it. But you get the evil eye if you say it out loud because it disrupts the academic. Yeah, flat earthers get the evil eye too. And that's this argument against evolution is just another kind of flat earther kind of attitude. Because it disrupts the academic racket? No, it's because they consider you to be essentially a kind of flat earther. I really think human science, which can only really make neat environmental hazard gadgets like mobile phone chips. I mean, where did Philalethes come from to come up with these ideas that all science can do is make environmental hazard gadgets? No. I mean, that is so obviously false that I think Philalethes has been indoctrinated by young Earth creationists somehow. So let's see here. A lawsuit comes out, big questions like what life is or what gravity actually is. Well, I mean, when you want to know what life is, obviously there's more than one answer. There's more than one fairly correct answer. Science is dealing with one aspect of that. Sort of like the biochemical aspect for starters. So, let's see. These questions can only be answered by considering all four causes of classical science. I'm not sure what all four causes of classical science would be. Whereas Bacon's modern science gets rid of formal and final causation, leading to a reductive idea of the world as a clockwork mechanism or optimization. Okay, so I am not even pushing any religions or theories. Yeah, actually, he is. I just find modern science to have such strong views that are unjustifiable! Yeah, I think the main unjustifiable attitude of science is their idea that it's actually explaining ultimate reality. I think that is an unjustifiable. I mean, that science is in any position to make metaphysical claims is unjustifiable. I would agree with that. But science has gotten us where we are today, which has its good points and its bad points, of course. But to say that science is just all it does is just make gadgets and it's just totally unrealistic and blah, blah, blah. It's just, I mean, it's delusional. So let's see. In a way, all knowledge outside of personal sacred beliefs is publicly unjustifiable, just as the Atthakavagga says. So the Atthakavagga says all views are unjustifiable, whether they're personal sacred beliefs or not. Don't believe anything, because beliefs they cannot grasp the highest truth. So you got to let go of those. If you want to know the highest truth, you got to let go of clinging to views, any kind of conceptual views. So let's just get back up to the actual question, which is, let's see, as someone who's iffy about the idea that species evolve at all, it seems like he's more than iffy. I mean, he's bashing away at the idea. I would like to hear your take on why you think species evolve. Okay, so for starters, there is the fossil record. I've talked about this before. The fossil record indicates very clearly, first of all, that 100 million years ago, the species were very different. 100 million years before that, the species were very different from 100 million years ago. It's like the species on this planet are changing. And you go to some place like the Grand Canyon, where you've got a river cutting through millions of years worth of like geological strata. And you find that in the deepest levels, there's no fossils. You get into a little higher up, a little more recent, there will be like bacterial fossils, which would be mainly like fossilized concretions, like bacterial crusts, bacterial nodules, that kind of thing. You find fossil remains of that, and that's it. And according to the experts, for the first few billion years of this planet's existence, all that existed on this planet, the only life that existed, was anaerobic bacteria. The fossil record supports this. Then gradually you get enough free oxygen due to photosynthetic bacteria, chemosynthetic bacteria living in an anaerobic atmosphere. You get enough free oxygen generated that metabolism can take off. That oxygen is actually kind of toxic, except to your mitochondria. Your mitochondria need free oxygen, because it causes like a massive increase in the efficiency of respiration. You can create more energy per molecule of glucose if you've got oxygen to work with. And just several times more energy is produced. And even now, I mean, even a goldfish can go completely anaerobic, but they're pretty much torpid. They just, multicellular life pretty much needs this boost in metabolism. So after there was free oxygen, then you had like the Cambrian explosion. First you had the evolution of like protozoans, eukaryotic life. And then protozoans, were like the first sign of this. And then the protozoans started becoming colonial. And next thing you know, you've got multicellular plants and animals. And the fossil record supports this. And then like the first animals, I mean, you had all kinds of weird dead ends. Like in the Precambrian explosion, you go to like the shale beds where there are a lot of fossils, all kinds of weird animals that just didn't make it because it was like random trial and error, like Darwin talks about. You had all these different mutations or whatever caused them to arise. And some of them were better adapted than others. And that still works nowadays. You've got some animals that are not perfectly adapted to their environment, like pill bugs, little isopod crustaceans. They live on the land, but they still breathe with gills. And so they're very limited in like what kind of environments they can live in. They have to live in moist environments. They get stuck out in the sun, they die. Their gills dry out, they can't breathe anymore, they die. So go in the fossil records, let's just set aside all the dead ends. So some of the earliest animals would be like jellyfish. It'd be all invertebrates. You'd have like brachiopods, worms. The fossil record doesn't show much until like shells and like carapaces, hard carapaces, that sort of thing started evolving. It's way easier for stuff to fossilize when you've just got an empty shell buried in mud or some other substrate that is preserved for hundreds of millions of years. And then like with regard to humans, I mean, you've got like primitive like arrow worms, or like the larvae of, what are they called? Sea squirts, or sort of like a proto-fish. They're like a little tadpole thing. And then that gradually turned into fish, which then through lungfish, which are actually a primitive kind of bony fish. It's like I read in one of those Jehovah's Witnesses books that was bashing evolution about how they're saying, it's like the gills of a fish would have to evolve into lungs in order for like amphibians to evolve from fish, but it doesn't work that way. I mean, it's like the lung is evolved from the swim bladder, or actually the swim bladder is evolved from a lung in fish. And the lung was, the swim bladder or the lung, it started off as a kind of buoyancy thing. It was like an offshoot of the digestive tract where a fish could gulp air and then it could like adjust their buoyancy, or they could spit out air and sink. They could come up and gulp air and it would make them float better, that kind of thing. And then that eventually evolved into a lung. So a fish like a lungfish or a sturgeon has gills and at least one lung. And then you get amphibians. The fossil record, when the first amphibians were emerging onto land, no reptiles yet, no birds, no mammals. And then the amphibians presumably evolve into reptiles. The reptiles evolve into mammals, dinosaurs, which then become birds, that kind of thing. And the first mammals, like primitive insectivore type things, like tree shrews, it'd be like the first placental mammals would be like tenrics. I guess the tenric is one of the most primitive placental mammals on Earth. It's kind of like a big shrew. And then you had some of those go arboreal, become like tree shrews. And then the tree shrews became like prosimian primates. And the fossil record supports this, just like chronologically. That the more human-like creatures didn't exist until recently, going with the fossil record. So the fossil record indicates clearly enough evolution occurred. How it occurred exactly, that can still be controversial. But to deny, I mean, unless you want to just say, okay, Jehovah God or some kind of magical force is just changing species over time, causing some to go extinct, others to flourish and then diversify, and just continuing this process. I mean, that process is happening. Just the fossil record alone is sufficient. And then you can have the Jehovah's Witnesses saying, oh, the fossil record's so incomplete, this and that. Bullshit. They're clutching at straws trying to support young earth creationism because the Bible says so. So just the fossil record indicates that evolution is happening. It doesn't explain the exact mechanism, what it is that's driving evolution, but the fact that evolution is happening should not be controversial. Another bit of evidence in favor of evolution is vestigial organs. Why is it that whales and pythons have vestigial hip bones, for example? They don't use them. They are vestigial. And that is a vestige from some previous quadruped form that whales and pythons are evolved from. Of course, not the same one. In the case of whales, it's a mammal. In the case of pythons, it's like a lizard. Some snake-like lizard, like a skink maybe, that still had little legs. Also, there's embryonic development. Like at one point in your lifetime, whoever you are watching this, you had gill slits like a shark. And I think it's even the primitive number of gill slits, like early sharks, more primitive sharks, like the 6-gill shark had 6 gill slits, whereas I think eventually it went to 5. 5 it was like a more derived number of gill slits. And I think like a human embryo or any mammalian embryo, just any embryo that's like a vertebrate, I mean, at one point they've got gill slits like a shark. And then most of those just fade out, except for one of the gill slits becomes the opening of your eustachian tubes. And then at a later stage in embryonic development, we've got 4 rows of nipples going down our chest like most mammals have. And then most of them fade out. At one point in our embryonic development, we're covered with fur, and then that fades out. So, I mean, why is embryonic development recapitulating phylogeny if evolution doesn't occur? I mean, the fact that evolution happens should not be controversial. You want to argue or quibble or whatever, it's how it happens. What is driving it? That is still a legitimate quibble. But to just say that evolution can't happen and doesn't happen, unless you just want to be magic and say Jehovah God is just like changing up the animal species in some order of like adaptation for mysterious reasons that we mortals can't understand, well, I guess you can do that too. But the very fact is, life has been changing over time on this planet. The fossil record shows it. Vestigial organs indicate it. Embryonic development indicates it. And that's enough. Charles Darwin remains God Emperor, as far as I'm concerned. Although, before I move on, I mean, you can add other forces that science can't really deal with, like Schopenhauerian will. That there's a kind of mind in this universe that's just seeking as much like phenomenal existence as it can. And that's helping to drive evolution, that sort of thing. I mean, like the first verse of the Dhammapada says, it's all mind made. So you can have some kind of mind driving this. That's fine. I wouldn't argue against that. Especially if it's like not like an intellectual kind of mind, but just sort of like this life force, Schopenhauerian will that's helping to drive this. I got no problem with that. And it wouldn't really be in conflict with scientific theory, even though science really can't touch it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred, and I do not understand this question. Fred does this sometimes. He'll ask questions where you're not sure if he's even asking a question, or you're not sure exactly what it is that he means. Like, are we allowed to treat ourselves? Well, I mean, treating ourselves, there was no real context that I was aware of. I mean, that's just the whole question right there that appeared in the comment section. Are we allowed to treat ourselves? And I suppose you could have it like in a medical sense, treat yourself medically, but I think he probably means something like recently it was National Donut Day. So you could just go down and celebrate National Donut Day by just gorging yourself on donuts or apple fritters, which I actually prefer. Are we allowed to? Well, I mean, obviously all is permitted, as Ivan Karamazov used to say. All is permitted if there is no God. But we don't need to get into the technicalities of this. Are we allowed to? And then maybe he means like in accordance with Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, are we allowed to just splurge and indulge sometimes and buy ourselves like a Lithuanian linen bathrobe that we don't entirely need, although it's very nice? Or eat donuts or whatever, have ice cream, that kind of thing. Technically, there would be some akusala kama involved, wallowing in sensuality, self-indulgence. It's not the best kind of karma. I mean, it's not totally evil. I mean, you're way better off eating ice cream than like torturing small animals, that kind of thing. But still, I mean, we're allowed to do it. We're allowed to do anything we're able to do, really. I mean, who's stopping us? But from a Buddhist point of view, you're better off not doing it. That you're just kind of complicating your situation and making it harder to wake up. If you are like wallowing in sensuality and self-indulgence and so forth. That's one of the two extreme paths that a good Buddhist should avoid. So I think I'm just going to move on to Fred's second question, which contains a typo, which I'm fixing now. Does nothing happen without sankharas? And sankhara is one of those Pali words that has multiple meanings. I'm not exactly sure what Fred's intended meaning for sankhara is here, but if you interpret sankhara in the broadest sense of just any kind of conditioned thing, anything that has a beginning and an end is a sankhara. It arises due to conditions, and then it passes away when those conditions pass away. So does nothing happen without sankharas? Nothing could happen without sankharas. Any kind of happening is involving sankharas. Without sankharas, nothing really happens. So sankharas are like the building blocks of samsara in a sense, at least with regard to the observable aspect of samsara. So I'm just going to move on to Fred's third question. Can Pure Land be beneficial to clean out kileshas, or in Pali, kilesas, which are defilements? So can Pure Land Buddhism help you to purify yourself, is essentially what Fred seems to be asking here. And I have to admit, it can, because based on my interaction with one Pure Land Buddhist in particular, who is on our Discord server, he's very puritanical with regard to basic Buddhist ethics. He's got some weird ideas with regard to like mythological space Buddhas and so forth. But with regard to just basic like 5 precepts, that kind of thing, he's completely on board with that. So to the extent that a Pure Land Buddhist still has like good Buddhist ethics, that kind of thing, then to that extent, it's going to be helping him to purify himself. He's trying to do good, avoid doing evil, purify his mind, like the Dhammapada says. This is the teaching of the Buddhas. So long as you're doing that, then you're going to be cleaning out your defilements to some degree. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Theravada. Here, I got to fix this a little bit. The question was in Burmese. No, wait. Damn. Excuse me a minute. I got to fix this. I got to fix it again. Okay, so then we go like this, and then I got to hit the return button. No, why is it not working? Oh, there we go. Okay. So this question is from Theravada, and he says, "Kalmbare upinyo akugo ayinga lo neban lochin dedala." And my answer to that is, "Hopbare." Now I'm gonna have some coffee now. But actually, Theravada, he was a friend of mine in Burma. I don't know if he's still a monk or not. So I don't know if I should be calling him a Shimpiya or not. Maybe he's still a monk. He was a serious monk, so there's a good chance that maybe he's still a monk. But Kalmbare just means like very good. And then Upinyo, that's what people call me in Burma, short for Pinyo Batha. Upinyo Akugo, what about now? Ayinga lo, like before, Nibbana Loche Nedala. Do you still desire Nibbana? And I have to admit that even though I'm not a monk anymore, the same kind of urge, the same sort of subliminal urge to be moving towards like being as awake as possible, transcending samsara, that sort of thing is still there. So really my attitude towards becoming enlightened hasn't changed all that much since I was a monk. It's just that when I was a monk, I was doing like the traditional practices that monks are supposed to do, which just stalled out in my case. I stopped making progress for years and years. So it's like if you're trying something for years and years and it's not working, then it just makes sense to try something else. And so I'm just applying it to samsara at this point, or applying it to worldly lay life at this point. Because even a monk is applying whatever he's applying to samsara, because that's the only thing you can apply anything to. So yeah, my attitude towards cultivating wisdom and so forth is still pretty solid. It's just like my methods are somewhat changed. It's like I've tried certain things. I know whether it works or not. I know if I've gotten benefit from it or not. I know if I used to get benefit and stopped getting benefit, or just stop making progress with it or not. That kind of thing. But yeah, I haven't just given up on like cultivating understanding, that sort of thing. Or striving towards, or just sort of gradually grinding away at like some sort of metaphysical perfection, or just like total realization of metaphysical perfection or some such. But yeah, my attitude really hasn't changed all that much. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Kyundru. And Kyundru says, are lay people allowed to give the 5 and or 8 precepts to other lay people, or is that role strictly reserved for monks? This is actually somewhat controversial in Burma, because of course in Burma, being a devoutly Buddhist country, it's just assumed that monks are supposed to do that kind of thing. But if there's no monks around, I mean, you can just take upon yourself 5 or 8 precepts. Generally, you take the 3 refuges first, and then the 5 or 8 precepts, or however many precepts you're going to take. So, I mean, you can just like bow in front of an altar and take the precepts yourself. You're not following along with what somebody else says, but just in front of the Buddha image or whatever, in the presence of whatever arahants happen to be aware of what you're doing, that kind of thing. I think traditionally that might even be preferable to taking 5 or 8 precepts from another layperson, but I don't remember seeing anywhere that is condemned, especially if there's no monks to take the precepts from. If you've got sort of Western lay people who just have no use for monks, they think that becoming a monk is just sort of an arbitrary career choice, and that lay people are just as good as monks. And so they just will just sort of snub monks and take the 5 or 8 precepts from each other, or from their Jewish lesbian meditation instructor or whatever. Then yeah, that would probably be frowned upon from a traditional Buddhist point of view. But I mean, you make do with what you've got. You know, if let's say you're too illiterate, or you know, you just don't know the formulas well enough, you're like a beginner in Buddhism, you could go to a teacher who really knows how to do the 5 or 8 precepts and take the 5 or 8 precepts from them. Especially if there's no monk around, you could just go to a lay teacher, that sort of thing. But to give them to each other, like one person gives the other one 5 precepts, and then the person who just took the 5 precepts gives the other one 5 precepts, that's just kind of pointless. You might as well just bow down in front of an altar or something, and in the presence of any divinity that or wisdom that happens to be lingering around that altar, or symbolically to the Buddha, you can just take the 5 or 8 precepts upon yourself. I mean, it's no rule that you even have to go through the ceremony. Just keeping the precepts is way more important than doing the Pali ceremony. Although a lot of Burmese people would disagree with that. They would think that taking 5 precepts is just kind of invalid if you don't, like, first go through the formal ceremony in front of a monk, or at least in front of a Buddha statue, and formally take upon yourself these precepts. But being a Westerner, I just don't think that way. So, let's see here. I'll just move on to Kyundru's second question. The next question is, besides the similarities between no, gnosis, and jnana, like the English word know, K-N-O-W, no, kno, gnosis, and jnana, what are some other words in English and Pali that have noticeable similarities due to their Indo-European origins? There is lots of them. Lots and lots and lots. Just starting with numbers. You know, it's like the Pali word for 2 is dwe. Pali word for 3 is tri, or ti, like Tipitaka or Tripitaka. The word for 4 is chataro, which doesn't sound like 4, but it sounds a hell of a lot like cuatro in Spanish, or the English word quarter, 1/4. The Pali word for 5 is pancha, which doesn't sound like 5, partly because Germanic languages turn P into F, but it sounds a lot like penta in Greek, like in the word pentagram, pentagon, that sort of thing. So numbers, simple numbers, are similar throughout the Indo-European languages. Also, just the most common words, like family names. The Pali word for brother is batar. The Pali word for mother is matar. You know, the Pali word for daughter is ditu, or ditaro. So it's like the most common words that are just basic to the language are the ones that are most likely to have parallels in English and Pali. And then some words are not so obvious, like the Pali word for boat is nawa, which doesn't sound like boat at all, or like ship, but nawa has the same like Indo-European etymology as the English words navy, navigate, nautical, that kind of thing. Or a lot of like simple animal words, especially if they're animals that were native to the Pontic steppes, like snake is the Pali word for snake is sapa, which I'm pretty sure would have like the same etymology as serpent. Or the Pali word for horse is asa, which comes close to ass, like a donkey, but also horse is based on the same etymology. Or also like the word for circle or wheel is chaka, which doesn't sound like wheel, but it's based on the same etymology as circle and cycle. that sort of thing. So, I mean, I could just sit here for an hour and just come up with word after word after word that has parallels or cognates or whatever between Pali and English, because they're both Indo-European languages. And so, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Indiana Dhamma. And Indiana Dhamma says, I have recently learned about the use of spirit tablets in East Asian ancestor veneration, including among some Buddhists. This led me to think about the practice of ancestor veneration and what place, if any, it has in Theravada. Given how rebirth is said to occur in Orthodox Theravada, I cannot see any reason to engage in ancestor veneration except perhaps as a way of memorializing them and honoring their memory. Yeah, ancestor worship is not really a big thing in Theravada Buddhist texts. In Theravada Buddhism, that's different. But just in like the Pali texts, I think probably I know there's mention of it. You know, like you've got like the householder who they make their morning ablutions, they tend to their sacred fire and all that. And one of the things they'll do is make little offerings to their ancestors. And the Buddha didn't really, I mean, he may have sort of redefined exactly how you're supposed to do it, but that was just established Indian tradition. Also, just the whole idea of hungry ghosts in Theravada Buddhism. The whole reason why these ghosts are hungry is because it's based on ancient Indian ancestor worship, where the ancestors that weren't receiving offerings were hungry. Those were the unfortunate ghosts. You know, peta, I mean, it comes from the word father, ancestor. So it's like the word for ghost in Pali is derived from the word for father, like as in forefather. You know, it's an ancestor. But of course, the meaning kind of changed and everything. And in like modern Burma, probably modern Thailand also, due to just due to more indigenous cultural influences rather than Theravada Buddhism, then there is a lot of not so much ancestor worship, but after a relative dies, then periodically the family members who survive that dead family member will come to a monastery and make offerings to the monks and then share their merit with their deceased ancestor. That is common, you know, just on a regular basis. I don't remember the exact timetable for when you're supposed to go back. Like the 1 year anniversary, pretty obvious. I think it's like 1 week and 2 weeks, and I don't know exactly what the timetable is. I was never extremely interested in that sort of thing. I tended, as a monk in Burma, I tended to avoid doing the purely cultural stuff. And I just kind of stayed by myself and meditated mostly. So, yeah, I think it was more out of like family sentiment that you would make offerings to your ancestors. I don't think there's not much concept in Theravada anymore of your ancestors becoming hungry ghosts if you're not making offerings to them and keeping them well fed, that kind of thing. So that's just sort of a vestigial aspect, because even religions evolve. And sometimes religions can evolve into a whole different religion, just like species, you might say. Let's see here. Oh, I forgot to. I don't think it's really necessary today because it's still daytime. But I forgot to jiggle the mouse or anything, and so that my woman's computer screen that kind of serves as a light, it went back off again because I always do that. So let's see, what is the exact question, and have I answered it yet? Let's see, what place, if any, does ancestor worship have in Theravada? Well, cultural Theravada, that isn't scriptural Theravada, has some of that, but it's not like making offerings to ancestors in general. You know, whatever ancestors I have, you know, may they be well and happy. There's not so much of that as just like your deceased parents, your deceased grandparents, that kind of thing. You commemorate them, and also, you know, periodically you go to the monastery and make donations on their behalf, kind of in their name, share the merit with them. That's about as far as it goes, really. But like what's going on in Sri Lanka, that sort of thing, I can't really say. But there's no real emphasis on it in like the Pali Tipitaka. That apparently ancient India was already kind of moving away from that at that point. I'm not sure, like modern Hindus, do they still make like regular offerings, like daily offerings to their ancestors? I don't know. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from PSA. And this is an easy one. Can you optimize an unpublished algorithm for quantum machine learning on a photonic processor? No. PSA's next question. Hoppin' John or Mohinga? I'm not sure what Hoppin' John is. It must be some sort of weird English ethnic food, possibly some kind of noodle soup, because Mohinga is noodle soup. So I have to choose between Hoppin' John or Mohinga. I'd choose the Mohinga just because the Hoppin' John is a mystery to me. I don't know what it is. Mohinga it's a good kind of noodle soup made out of sort of spaghetti-sized rice noodles that are white and softer than spaghetti. And sometimes there's a little bit of chicken in it, but it's just kind of like this broth. It's got like banana tree slices in it, which is kind of nice. It's good. Mohinga is good. Hoppin' John, I really can't say. So I'm just going to go with the sure thing. And I'm just going to move on to PSA's third question, which is as follows. Are we recording here? I'm just going to make sure about this. Okay. In your experience as a monk, you surely must have come across other monks considering disrobing and then actually doing it. Can you rank the reasons for disrobing from the following list from biggest to smallest? And then he's got boredom, loss of faith, lust, getting kicked out for misbehavior. Feel free to add another reason if you think it's major and I didn't include it here. Well, among Western monks, like there'd be two monks sitting around talking and they'd say, oh, by the way, so-and-so dropped out of the monkhood. And then the other monk will say, why? And then the first one will say, the usual reason, which means he wanted a woman. So for Western monks especially, who are somewhat higher T, I guess, than like Burmese monks, then desire for a woman is a more significant reason for dropping out. And the other main reason boredom, that would apply to some monks, both Burmese and Western. Loss of faith, I only know of one case of that really, but usually the loss of faith happens after you I remember Jnanavira in his letters. He's a famous English monk from Ceylon back in the 50s and early 60s, was saying that it's weird that when people like Westerners especially drop out of the monkhood, they not only stop practicing Buddhism, but they stop being Buddhists. Let's see. Getting kicked out for misbehavior, that's very rare. Yeah, I'm not even sure if I know of any cases like that. I mean, I've heard of a few cases where some Western monks were just kind of nutty, or they were like cracking up or something, and then they'd get sent away. But you can't. I mean, nobody has the power to disrobe a monk other than himself. So you don't really get kicked out of the Sangha unless you commit a parajika offense. If you don't commit a parajika offense or deliberately disrobe yourself, then the worst that the Sangha can do is just do like a formal act of expulsion from the Sangha, which doesn't stop you from being a monk. It's just that you're like cut off. You know, it's like you're getting the silent treatment. Other monks aren't allowed to do anything, do any formal actions with you or live under the same roof with you or anything like that, or bow to you or have you bow to them, anything like that. So that one is just, and then these formal acts of the Sangha are pretty much extinct, at least in Burma. So let's see here. Yeah, there was a famous Thai Ajahn back in like the 1990s who, I mean, he was parajika. You know, he was going on world tours, like giving Dhamma talks, and then it turned out that he was like having call girls come to his hotel rooms, and he was paying on his credit card. So the Thai government had proof that he was like paying prostitutes in his hotel room, that kind of thing. But technically, he didn't so much get kicked out for misbehavior by anyone but himself. It was his parajika that kicked him out. And then the Thai government just kind of enforced that. So with regard to Burmese monks, their main reason for dropping out is just sort of worldly mindedness. You know, they've got unresolved worldly desires. They want to make money. They want to drive a car. Maybe they want a woman, but it's not as pronounced in Burmese monks as it is in Western monks. Western monks are more inclined to just, they want a woman, so they drop out. Or, you know, they've got unresolved issues. Or another one is they've got aging parents and they feel like this filial duty to go take care of their mother who has Alzheimer's or something. That happens a lot too. That might be like the second most usual, at least the official reason why a monk is dropping out of the monkhood in the West is, I got to take care of my mother, that kind of thing. I mean, a lot of monks, I mean, they go into it with this intention that it's not going to be permanent. You know, I'm just going to be a monk. I knew this one guy. He had this plan. He's going to be a monk. He's going to go to Pandita Rama, become a monk. Within 5 years, he'll be an Arya, and then he'll drop out and come back to California and go to some place like Spirit Rock and set himself up as a Dhamma teacher there. So that's kind of a reason too, is just that it's not intended to be a permanent thing anyway. So if you include boredom as just still have like worldly interests that you just want to get back into, that would be probably the main reason for Burmese monks, and sort of one of the more important reasons for Western monks. But Western monks and Burmese monks, it's like two different species of bhikkhu, seems to me. So I suppose I answered that question in a roundabout sort of way. Yeah. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cleefy. And Cleefy says, in my sitting practice, I reach the state where my thoughts calm down and don't run like crazy from the past to the future and so on. My questions are, how do I stabilize this state and where do I go from there? Well, to stabilize it, I mean, you just continue practicing it. And also, I mean, if you're getting better at your meditation, then you can gradually evolve your meditation into a subtler form of meditation. So it's like if you've got a busy, distracted mind, you need a busy kind of meditation, having you noting lots of stuff, having you do a lot of busy work in your mind to keep your mind occupied on the meditation subject. But as your mind gets quieter and calmer, then you need a quieter, calmer meditation technique, because you don't want to just be pounding away at the ABCs after you don't need to do that anymore. But if you try something too subtle than you're ready for, then your mind's just going to overflow the meditation object and you're just going to be thinking it all over the place. So to stabilize the state, just continued practice, and also you can move on to a more advanced kind of meditation. Once you've got like the more elementary basics down, then you can go to a more subtle kind of meditation that will get you into more and more subtle meditation states. But even if you're just meditating on your breath, I mean, that can, even without really changing the primary object, you might change the way that you're going about noting the primary object. You know, you might stop labeling, and then you're just observing it. And then eventually you'll stop focusing just on the breath and just kind of like have a wide open focus, like a cheap camera kind of a thing. You know, so you can, first you just continue practicing. And also, once you've got a certain meditation down and you're not really progressing with it anymore, then you switch to a more subtle method that's a little more challenging that you haven't mastered yet, and then you just keep going with that. And so you should be getting more and more subtle until eventually you're just sitting there just empty and wide open. So I guess that answers both of these questions. How do you stabilize it, and where does he go from there? But without knowing the particulars of your case, I really couldn't give very much particular advice with regard to your particular case. But just, when your mind becomes calmer, go to a calmer meditation technique. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, what do you think is going on when we experience deja vu? And that's an interesting question. And I'm not 100% sure how to answer it. I mean, I've read it was like a cognitive science book that some cognitive scientists had this theory that when you have deja vu, what's actually happening is it's just sort of like this little recognition center in your brain is glitching a little bit. And so it's sort of like making you feel like you recognize this unique situation that has never happened before as something that happened before. But that wouldn't explain at least one deja vu that I've had where it was just right in advance of what was happening. It was like a deja vu before the thing even happened. So it was like precognitive. And I was just like 20 years old at the time, sitting in this room and just grinning like an ape because I knew that someone in that room was going to say this weird sentence, and they said it, and I'm just sitting there, man. That was really remarkable for me because it was like a deja vu. It felt like a deja vu, but it was like a precognitive deja vu. It wasn't just this seems familiar. It was like this seems familiar, and I know what's going to happen next, kind of a thing. So. Yeah, so it could be a certain amount of paranormal, just precognition involved. Or it wouldn't be precognition, but I mean, it's like there could be sort of some glitch in the matrix, or, if Einstein is correct and the future already exists, the past still exists in a sense, like the Theravada Buddhists were saying, then, you're sort of like breaking loose from the present moment a little bit, or it could involve something like that, I guess. But frankly, I mean, I do not know exactly how deja vu works. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's next question, which is, why do we have doppelgangers? And I'm not exactly sure what he means by this, like doppelgangers. I mean, it's like the double, it's like the ghost double. And when I first learned the word doppelganger, it was in an English lit class in college. We were reading Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and the teacher, the instructor, was saying that in that novel, Raskolnikov, the protagonist, has two doppelgangers, at least two. One is Svidrigailov, who is like the debauched, he's like an aristocrat with like no morals. And then there was Sonia, the prostitute. And Sonia, the prostitute, ironically, is the most Christ-like figure in the novel. So it was like these two doppelgangers, they're like representing like alternate identities to the protagonist. Svidrigailov, the debauched aristocrat, represents what Raskolnikov could become if he just followed his head and ignored his heart and just followed this kind of Nietzschean philosophy and ignoring just sort of like deeper, like religious, spiritual, ethical kind of stuff. Whereas Sonia the prostitute was a doppelganger representing what he could become if he followed his heart instead of his head. Because even though she was a prostitute, she was sort of like the fictional prostitute with a heart of gold whose father was dead. Her mother was dying of tuberculosis. She had two children. She had like two like a brother and a sister who were practically having to beg in the streets of St. Petersburg back in the mid 1800s just to get food. And so prostitution was legal in Russia at that time. So she just went and got a card and was making money just to prevent her brother and sister from starving to death, essentially. But I mean, I've come across a doppelganger. There was a monkey in Burma that was a doppelganger of mine. I was just traveling through this part of I mean, this monastery probably doesn't even exist. I think it got bulldozed to make the new capital city of Naypyidaw because it was in that area of Burma. And there was this monkey chained to a tree. And he spent most of his time doing, I mean, if there was any other animal, like a scroungy monastery dog or a chicken or something that came within range of his chain, he'd scamper down out of the tree and start pestering them. And then they would go away, of course, because they didn't like being pestered by a monkey. But when he wasn't doing that, which is most of the time, he had somehow come across a piece of like transparent red plastic. You know, you could see through it, but it was red. And he would just sit on this tree branch, just holding this red plastic up to his eyes in fascination. He was just fascinated by how everything turns red when you look through this plastic. So that was like his only possession, really, was this piece of red plastic. And then also, if he wasn't doing that, being a monkey, he was attending to his own pee-pee. And really, I mean, that kind of symbolized me as a young monk. I mean, I was still very lustful. I was always kind of wrestling with that kind of situation, but also just holding up the red plastic. I mean, that he had like the simple monkey version of philosophy where you're looking at the world and seeing it all transformed through, you know, some gimmick of like philosophically questioning the reality of it, that kind of thing. And then as I was leaving the monastery, I happened to walk close to his tree, and he just ran down out of the tree and just climbed up my body so that we're eye to eye, and he just kissed me right on the cheek. And this Burmese guy that was with me, that was acting sort of like my guide, I mean, he was just dumbfounded. Finally, he's able to stammer out, "It just kissed you on the cheek." But then I moved away and got out of range, and that was the end. But I considered that monkey to be my doppelganger. Also, when I was in my early 20s, I considered myself to be a kind of doppelganger of my girlfriend's brother. I mean, I was the doppelganger in that case. You know, I represented what he could become if he was less of a realist, if he was more of an idealist. But aside from that, it's like, why do we have doppelgangers? I mean, a doppelganger is just kind of like a fictional, or, you know, it's just sort of like this symbolic thing that you superimpose upon reality. I mean, you don't necessarily really have doppelgangers other than just maybe the way your karma is constructed. You're sort of like spinning off sort of mirror reflections of yourself all around you. I mean, that's some spiritual teachers say that, like Eckhart Tolle will say that. I mean, the whole world around you is actually a kind of mirror reflection of what's going on inside you. So in that case, everybody would be a kind of doppelganger, it would seem like. But mainly a doppelganger is just a kind of fictional gimmick, like when you're writing a novel or something. I guess. I'm not exactly sure what Xenothoid is referring to in that case. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's third question, which is, when you look into a mirror, who is looking back at you? And nobody. I mean, it's just a reflection. So nobody's looking back at you. Don't worry about that. So I guess, without elaborating on that one, I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libra Lamb, and occasionally also known as Libra Lamb, and known by other things too. Just very complicated. So I'm just going to answer his question here. What practical measures would you say are make or break for a deep meditation? Posture, following breath feeling, etc. Well, I mean, you can give general guidelines, but the general guidelines aren't necessarily going to apply to everybody. I mean, some people can spontaneously go into a deep meditative state on a roller coaster at a carnival. So, I mean, as a general rule, if I was giving instructions to somebody, you know, I would include, you know, don't try to meditate on a roller coaster at a carnival. But for some people, it can just spontaneously, they'll just have like some mystical experience. I think the main thing with regard to deep meditation is try to avoid meditation techniques that involve a lot of thinking. That's, if you've got an active mind, you got to do that, but you got to use an active meditation to keep your mind occupied and like keep it from wandering away. But I mean, that's not very deep meditation. It's still valid meditation. It's like, sort of like elementary meditation that will get you to a position where it's easier to get into deep meditation. But deep meditation, you're not going to be thinking no more. Just not thinking is one of the most important things about like deep meditation. Or just thinking as little as possible. Don't think any more than you have to. Posture, like if you're sitting like straight up and down, that's definitely going to help your meditation. If you're just kind of leaning forward or slouching, that kind of thing, you're going to have like a leany, slouchy kind of mental state. But if you've got like an alert mental state or an alert posture, a posture that's generally associated with alertness, like straight up and down, it just naturally helps you to be more alert. Full lotus, I mean, my experience with the full lotus, it can improve your meditation by like 3% just automatically for whatever reason. But I mean, the main things with regard to, if you want deep meditation, first, you got to find a quiet place where you're not going to be interrupted. Not a lot of like weird random background noises, that kind of thing. Just find a quiet, secluded place, and then don't think any more than you have to. If you're able to meditate without thinking, you're probably better off not thinking. And then if you still have to think in your meditation just to keep your mind from thinking about other things, then you just keep doing that until you get it down, until you get better at it, and then you can get away with thinking less and less. You're not having to like label things like Mahasi method. You're just like hitting the object with a stick over and over again, labeling it. That's fine for beginners, but I mean that's like the ABCs. You don't want to keep doing that after you've gotten good at it. Then you move on to like a deeper level of that. So I guess the two main things would be, let's say 3. Find a secluded place that's quiet. Have a good posture, straight up and down, preferably sitting cross-legged on the floor. But if for whatever reason you have to sit in a chair or whatever, you can do that too, I suppose. And just kind of have your meditation calibrated so that you're not thinking any more than you have to. Because to get into the deepest meditation, you have to stop thinking. So, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. Also from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as et cetera, which is, how often did you get milk with your alms as a monk? Not very often, because, I mean, the Burmese are not real milk drinkers. Most people in this world cannot digest lactose. They're lactose intolerant, unlike we members of the master race, so to speak. It's mostly people of Indo-European ancestry that can digest milk, which is one of the many reasons why the Indo-Europeans were able to conquer so much of the world, at least culturally, linguistically. Even if they weren't doing it militarily in all cases, still, you can like harvest more calories from an acre of dairy land than an acre of like beef cattle. So you can have higher population density than the Indo-Europeans could because they drank milk. But I'm digressing. Getting milk with my alms, it happened very rarely, and there were just a few supporters that knew that I liked milk. They knew that I could drink it. And so I'd get like this plastic bag of warm milk in my bowl, and it would have like this rubbery layer of like cream. I guess it was like rubbery cream floating on the top. In the West, it gets homogenized, so it gets all like emulsified into the milk, I guess. But in Burma, you get like it's just floating on the top. And I remember once remarking to this lady that gave me some of this milk, it's like, milk is better if it's not chewy. And then she was like, she was just amazed. It's like, I pay extra for it to have that cream on it. So let's see here. Yeah, it didn't happen very often, and usually it doesn't because, as I say, most Asians can't even drink milk without getting the squirts or something. So I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme, etc., etc., etc.'s third question, which is, what are your thoughts about secular Buddhists dismissing the reality of enlightenment as magical thinking while claiming to be Buddhist? Yeah, I mean, my experience with most Western Buddhists is that, they're Buddhist second at best. Even their political views will take precedence over Dhamma or Dharma in many cases. And a lot of them just can't tell the difference between like leftist political, like, what is it, indoctrination and actual Dharma. I've talked about this lots of times. So, I mean, they're accepting certain techniques from Buddhism, which, if they practice them, can actually help them to become wiser, so that their reasons for meditating will become wiser, their understanding of Dhamma will become wiser. So, I mean, so long as you start meditating to begin with, you can have bad reasons. Let's say you just want to develop psychic power so you can fuck up your enemies, that kind of thing. I mean, so long as it gets you meditating, taking Dharma more seriously, then you're going to get benefit from that. Your wisdom will develop, and then you may like abandon, worse reasons and accept better reasons. Sort of like the Buddha, who I think it was his half brother. That he sort of, in a way, kind of tricked him into becoming a monk by showing it was his wedding day. And so the Buddha shows him, I mean, this is what the celestial nymphs look like in heaven. And he shows them these goddesses, gives them this vision of these just impossibly gorgeous celestial nymphs in heaven, which made human women look sort of like a burnt monkey. And so then, he became a monk because he wanted those nymphs. But then he was practicing correctly, under the supervision of the Buddha himself. And so eventually he just got wiser and wiser, had liberating insight, became enlightened, and didn't want the nymphs no more. That kind of thing. So, I mean, you can start doing Buddhist practice for like silly reasons, but if you practice correctly, it will help you to get have better understanding, so that you'll start having better reasons and a better understanding of Dhamma. But I do agree that a lot of like the boomer meditation sangha in America that I had interactions with, they tend to be very smug, and it's kind of a superficial approach to Dhamma. And, it's like they reject, even the teachers will reject, even karma, nirvana, rebirth, some of the basic like tenets of Buddhism, including the goal. And, it's just, they just think that if Western science can't explain it, then it's bullshit, or it's mythology or magical thinking, or just, some ancient culture that we don't have to take seriously anymore. Some of them just, because their practice isn't very deep, or they've just got certain like karmic obstacles or whatever, they just never get past the superficial level. But, I mean, in some, if you do practice correctly, then, it's like your understanding evolves and gets better, and you can kind of move on from that. So, but yeah, I mean, it is blameworthy for a teacher of Dhamma, a teacher of a group of people calling themselves Sangha. He's just sort of poo-pooing the whole idea of like karma or enlightenment, nirvana, that kind of thing. Is just, in a way, it's slandering, it's misrepresenting the Buddha, what the Buddha taught, and just sort of peddling some inferior, extremely watered down version of Dhamma, which is better than no Dhamma at all, I suppose. But yeah, Buddhism in the West has really mutated radically as a result of arrogant Westerners who just assume that the Western point of view is the correct point of view, and then they're just going to be adding little bits and pieces that they think is an improvement. But it's, it's like they're fitting what parts of Buddhism will fit into like a scientistic point of view. And so it's not even really Dhamma at that point. It's like semi-Dhamma, fragments of Dhamma that are just sort of force fit into gaps in a scientific point of view, a leftist scientific point of view, more often than not. So I guess I answered that question. I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Cherzaskazis. And Cherzaskazis says, if this universe or our happiness-misery ratio is balancing itself out to zero, why Jains were wrong torturing themselves? If you torture yourself for 20 years, then all is left is happiness for the rest of one's life, according to this theory. Yeah, that's kind of what Jesus was apparently teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, too. It's better to cry than to laugh. It's like you have to be like miserable in this life in order to be happy in the next life, which lasts forever, which is not a good equation balancing out to zero, is it? But the Jains were wrong for torturing themselves, partly because they were making more karma by doing it. And they were getting a certain satisfaction from torturing themselves. I mean, that's the way it works with just about anybody who's wallowing in misery, is they're getting a certain satisfaction, a certain kind of perverse happiness from wallowing in misery or torturing themselves or whatever. Some people, they just, like their sicknesses and their mental disabilities or whatever, it gives their life meaning, and they'll just talk about it to anybody and they get satisfaction from that. It's like they're venting or whatever. And when you believe that you are striving for enlightenment, that you're doing the right thing, that you're this heroic spiritual warrior by torturing yourself, you are getting satisfaction from doing that, in addition to just making more karma, because the Jains were torturing themselves not to balance out the happiness misery ratio so much as they were just trying to burn off all of their karma, especially their bad karma, by just speeding up. It's a kind of spiritual accelerationism, but that deliberate intention and the deliberate efforts to torture themselves were really just making more karma. And it was kind of a messed up, torture-y kind of karma. So, I mean, the happiness-misery ratio balances out to zero regardless of what you do. If you wallow in, like somebody who's just got a short temper and they just get pissed off a lot, I mean, superficially they seem unhappy, but yet they derive satisfaction from venting their anger. So it's just this weird kind of, I don't know what you call it, this weird balance of happiness and misery that's happening. Even though someone might appear to be miserable, it's like sometimes they get the satisfaction from this idea that they deserve to be miserable or whatever it is. It's just like this, they're the spiritual hero that's taking satisfaction in torturing themselves for the sake of glorious liberation and all that. Okay. So I think I'm just going to move on to Cherzaskas's second question, which is, have you considered going to a sperm bank and leave your genetic mark for future generations? No. And like Danny Glover used to say on the old Lethal Weapon movie, I'm getting too old for this shit. Maybe when I was young and I was just full of juice, I might, I'll just squirt some over that way. But as I've gotten older and I'm having to work for a living and just attending to samsaric duties and all that, that I just have less inclination to be squirting my precious bodily fluids in all directions. Well, too much information there maybe, but I don't care. It's my show. Let's see here. Yeah, I mean, that would be the main thing. It'd also be weird, like, if you donate sperm to a sperm bank and then some woman you don't even know is going to be having a child that you are technically the father of. I mean, I wouldn't want that responsibility of just my own children being raised by strangers that I've never met before. I haven't vetted them or anything. So, yeah. I'm just going to move on to the next question. Also from Trzaska's is, what is that plant on the right of you? Well, I assume Trzaska's is referring to that one. Let's see here. I got to get this window out of the way. Oh man, I didn't even have this set up right. It's supposed to be like that so you can gaze in awe and wonder at my fish tank. And I got to change out the hornwort soon. It's getting kind of raggedy. So that plant, right. How do I point at this thing? Right there. That's a spider plant. It's supposed to be a good plant. It like cleans the air and stuff, and it doesn't require a lot of bright light. It grows just about anywhere. So yeah, I think that's a spider plant. Now I got to move this window back here. Okay. So the next question is from Austin. And Austin says, is karma and mind created or uncreated? If uncreated and eternal, they would possess divinity and thus be defined as gods following the Western paradigm. So karma is certainly created. Now we are creating karma. That's what we're doing. So yeah, karma is created, definitely. And mind, it all depends on how you look at it. I mean, you could say that like various spiritual traditions, including a few obscure Buddhist, like Theravada Buddhist sutras or suttas, indicate that, the highest reality is infinite formless consciousness. But, so you could say that kind of mind is uncreated, but because it is infinite and formless, it's without any kind of discrete content, and you can't really say if it exists or doesn't exist. It's just off the scale. But mind that you can perceive, mind that you can actually get some kind of handle on, that is created. And that includes karma, because karma is a mental state. So, yeah, it's just in a constant state of flux. It's all anicca in that sense. All impermanent, inconstant. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Harim Cthulhu. And Harim Cthulhu is being a wise guy here. He says, what would the Buddha think about people who try to guess thoughts of enlightened beings? And that is a good question. And I'm going to just move on to the next question here. This is from Throat Warbler Mangrove. And Throat Warbler Mangrove says, was the Buddha an anti-natalist? And what are your thoughts on antinatalism? And I've had a few questions along these lines. The Buddha was, ideally he would have been an anti-natalist. He's saying the best thing you can do is just renounce worldly life, which includes renounce family life, go off into a forest and meditate until you are liberated. So he'd be an anti-natalist in that sense, although he wasn't speaking out really like vociferously against people who have families. Just being realistic, most people are just not ready to renounce the world and go off and meditate in tiger-infested and bandit-infested forests. So, sort of from a spiritual point of view, he would be an anti-natalist, but just from a realistic acceptance of the way things are, then, he's not going to be like bashing people that have children and raise families, that sort of thing. And with regard to my own thoughts on antinatalism, I'm less antinatalist now than I was as a young man. Having children, it's not for everybody, seriously. Although you can say that, well, the population is crashing, especially the populations in developed countries like the West, and also like Japan and South Korea and places like that, the population is decreasing. But just because the population decreases, that's not necessarily a bad thing. This world would be fine with 1 billion people instead of 8 billion people. 1 billion would probably be preferable to 8 billion. But the problem is, of course, that when you've got a welfare state, when you've got socialism, then it's such a heavy drain, a heavy drag on like the federal budget. All these pensions and social security and everything that, a diminishing number of young workers are paying for and an increasing number of old retired people are benefiting from. That's where the real problem comes in. If you didn't have the welfare state, then more people would be having children because children would be their social security, especially if they didn't have a pension either, or a 401k or whatever. But with regard to antinatalism, I didn't want to have kids when I was a young man. Partly, I was intending to become a monk anyway, so there's that. But even if I hadn't become a monk, back then, like back in the 80s and early 90s, it wasn't so much global warming, that sort of thing. It was thermonuclear Armageddon, the Cold War, back when the USSR still existed. That'd be like the 80s mainly, for me anyhow. It's like, who knows what this world is going to be like 10 years from now or 20 years from now. It's just, you have to be willing to gamble with the lives of your children, that they're not going to be growing up in a kind of like radioactive hellscape. But now it turns out there was no Cold War. There was no hot war, that came as a result of the Cold War. There was no World War III yet. Hasn't been one yet. Except for maybe the cold one might be considered World War III. So antinatalism, I think I answered this question like just 1 or 2 Q&As ago, where, it's for each person to decide for themselves. Nowadays, if I knew then what I know now, and I have the woman then that I have now, I might be willing to have kids. Just as a kind of civic duty. Even though it's one hell of a sacrifice of like your freedoms and so forth. It's one hell of an obligation to raise children. It's just not just that you're paying for their food, making sure they go to school, that kind of thing. It's your duty to do what you can to ensure that they grow up to be relatively good, relatively happy, relatively healthy human beings. And most people just really don't know how to do that. Because they're not particularly good, happy, healthy human beings. So, I can go either way. I really don't have a dog in the fight. So, if you want to have kids, go ahead and have kids. If you don't want to have kids, then don't have kids. But it's better, if you do have kids, get married before you have kids. Let's see. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from M Files. And M Files said, this is a statement from a famous Vajrayana teacher. Quote, people try spiritually to achieve realization. The true realization is to achieve a kind heart. Other than that, there is nothing really that is useful, unquote. And then M Files says, I find that it sounds very pop Buddhism, easily digestible. What do you think of it? Yeah, it's very superficial. The true realization is to achieve a kind heart. Yeah, there's a lot of kind-hearted beings out there that are still wallowing in delusion. So, yeah, I would disagree with the famous Vajrayana teacher. I don't know if he's a monk or she's a nun or they're just like some Dzogchen instructor or what they are. I don't know. But people try spiritually to achieve realization. The true realization is to achieve a kind heart. Yeah. Other than that, there's nothing really that is useful. Well, what's so useful about a kind heart? You're going to look at it that way. How is having a kind heart more useful than having like an understanding of reality? So, yeah, I think it is very superficial and false from a Buddhist point of view. And I do not agree with it. You're probably better off being a wise person that's kind of crotchety and people don't like you much than to be just very sweet, nice person who is just kind of incompetent and just wallowing in delusion. So I'm just going to move on to M-File's next question, which is, I know you always tell us that very few people understand the dependent origination teaching. Some of the things that really make me confused is, how is there an origination if there is no primordial cause? Origination from what? Well, you could say that there's a primordial foundation, especially if you're unorthodox, in which case you'd say, there's like infinite formless consciousness is like the ground of being. It's like the quantum field in theoretical physics. It contains infinite energy and zero energy somehow at the same time. It's like infinite being and non-being at the same time, in a sense. And it's just off the scale. It just doesn't apply to samsara. From a samsaric point of view, it's just not there. You can't point to it. You can't discern it. You can't perceive it. It may as well just be completely non-existent. And from a samsaric point of view, it's just words. But I mean, that is like the essence. Let's just go back to the theory of the block of marble that I've yammered away about so many times. You've got this block of marble, and it contains within it every single possible statue in potential form. Every molecule of each statue is already there in the exact right position. The statue is in there. It's just that it exists in like virtual or potential form because no sculptor has carved it out. It's just in there in potential form. And that's every possible scenario, every possible reality is contained in virtual form there, including all this stuff arising and passing away, all the karma and the delusion and the suffering beings and all that. It's like their ultimate essence is this stone that cannot be perceived, that is really not part of samsara. But samsara is composed of the statues that exist in a kind of potential or conditional form. So the primordial cause, there is no primordial cause because this has been going on just forever. There is no beginning to it. So, yeah, the origination is also just sort of potential and conditional. So I hope I answered that question because, I've answered the question like dozens of times at this point. And if you've heard me explain it, 3 times or more, you still don't get it, then you're just going to have to find someone else try to explain it to you. And maybe they'll have better luck than I have. But M-Files is kind of a new questioner unless he changed his name recently. So he has kind of an excuse here because it may be that he hasn't seen very many of my Q&As where I'm answering essentially the same questions over and over again at times. Not all the questions, but there are certain types of question that keep getting asked. Like, what would the Buddha think about, what's an enlightened mind like? This kind of thing. Those are questions also that I get asked a lot. So let's see, or just karma questions, is it wholesome or unwholesome to do, action X, that kind of thing. So let's see here. I'm just going to move on to M-Files' third question, which is, if beings are illusory, karma is also illusory. So how can there be consequences from illusory actions? Because they are illusory consequences. The whole thing is virtual. And it's not just totally fake because, like I said, those statues really are in there. Every single molecule of, the Venus de Milo or like Laocoon and his sons being eaten by snakes, or the discus thrower, the dying Gaul, Rodin's thinker, they're all in there. Every molecule exactly in the right place. So it's like a potential existence. So the beings have a potential existence or conditional existence. Karma has a potential or conditional existence. And so the consequences from these potential or conditional actions are also potential or conditional. That's what dependent co-arising is. It's all conditional. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Pedro. And Pedro says, what do you think of Prophet Jerome Fernando from Sri Lanka? This is the first I've ever heard of him, as far as I can tell. I do not recall ever hearing of the Prophet Jerome Fernando before Pedro asked me about him. So what do I think about him? I don't know. I never heard of him. So I'll just move on to Pedro's second question, which is, if many people, many in the sense of more than 100 people, believe that a person has healing powers, can that belief alone grant that person healing powers? For example, the Prophet Jerome Fernando. So I guess the Prophet Jerome Fernando was also a kind of faith healer. So if many people believe that someone has healing powers, can that belief alone grant that person healing powers? Yeah, I'd say yes. I mean, it's really the belief of the person that he's healing would be the main person who should believe in it. It's like in the New Testament, like I think I said this in the previous Q&A, when Jesus would heal somebody of blindness or whatever, and the person would thank Jesus, Jesus would say, it's your own faith that healed you. If you didn't have the faith, you wouldn't have got healed. And that's why when he went back to his own hometown of Nazareth, he wasn't able to heal very many people there. It's because everyone was skeptical. It's like, hey, isn't that Jesus, the carpenter's son? I mean, don't his brothers and sisters live here? Who does he think he is? So if one person believes that this person has healing powers, then that belief alone can grant that person healing powers, at least with regard to that one person. So, I mean, in a way, you got more people believing that someone has healing powers. It makes it easier for additional people to believe that that person has healing powers, which then will help that person have healing powers just due to the power of faith that can move mountains, supposedly. So, yeah, I mean, it's mainly, the belief of the prophet himself would certainly help. And then the belief of the person being healed, the belief of the people around who are like observing would also definitely like contribute to this group mind that is helping this thing to happen. So, yeah. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And Siddhartha Lohachita says, and he's being kind of transgressive or something here. He says, why do you think black people or those of black descent in America are rarely interested in the Dharma? I've seen that there are Buddhist monasteries in Africa, like in Congo and South Africa, but it seems that black people tend to be more drawn to monotheistic extremism, such as Islam or Christianity. Well, black people aren't necessarily drawn to monotheistic extremism. I mean, before Islam and Christianity had missionaries and others converting people in sub-Saharan Africa, I would guess they're mostly animists, which is not monotheistic. But yeah, I think there's one monastery in Uganda. I've seen like little video clips of black monks going for alms round in Uganda, I think it is. And, black villagers waiting there to put food in their bowl. It's somehow working. And so partly it's cultural. I would guess that mainly it's cultural. It's just a cultural thing that is not really black culture. It's more Asian culture, and then like some yuppie boomer type culture that started like back in the 1950s with Zen Buddhism. And, then it finally you had like the Vipassana movement starting in the 70s and so forth. That's more of a white thing. But it is true, like even in the West, I've seen like 2 or 3 black Buddhists, or just 2 or 3 black Buddhists anywhere. Like in Burma, I can remember seeing one. He was following the Sun Lun method, and his idea was he was just going to be a monk for a little while until he got the Sun Lun method down, and then he was going to drop out and go back and teach the Sun Lun method. Yeah, so I mean, it is rare. And so I think the main reason is just cultural, because Black people are followers of culture. And also, like a secondary reason is just that Theravada Buddhism is largely an intellectual kind of spiritual system, and Black people are less likely to be intellectually inclined than white people or East Asian people. Although in Burma, there's a lot of very non-intellectual villagers who are extremely devout Theravada Buddhists. And it's weird. It's like you can go out to some remote village and you can overhear, these two old village guys sitting around just discussing like subtle points of Abhidhamma philosophy. So I would guess that it's primarily a cultural thing. But then you've got like the DEI, you got leftist quasi-Buddhists, some of whom don't believe in enlightenment and so forth, like was being discussed earlier, who, there's some Black meditator, they're going to that Black meditator is going to get promoted up to teacher level, regardless of whether they're really qualified to be a teacher. So you got like the DEI leftist Buddhists in the West who are promoting for all their worth Black Buddhists, just trying to get as many Black Buddhists to fill the quota as possible, which isn't necessarily helping very much, because then you wind up with incompetent diversity hires teaching Dhamma. You've got enough white ones. You don't have to just add new colors of incompetent Dhamma teachers. Not that all of them are incompetent, I'm sure, but when you see a Black surgeon or a Black airline pilot or a Black Dhamma teacher, there's naturally this little bit of doubt that arises. Like, are they really qualified, or do they just get the job to fill a quota? So I'm just going to move on to Siddhartha Lohachita's next question, which is, do you know the philosophy about war, change, and the opposites from Heraclitus? I've read about Heraclitus long ago. I know like his famous saying, you can't step into the same river twice. Everything is change. But I don't recall his philosophy of war, whether that's just sort of like some elemental kind of warfare going on, or whether he's actually talking about people with spears and shields and helmets out like stabbing each other in a field somewhere. But yeah, really, I don't know all that much about Heraclitus, partly because I really did not agree much with Heraclitus. I tended more to be more the Eleatic type of person. I liked like Parmenides, all is one, rather than like atomizing the universe and it's all these different parts interacting with each other. So that's one reason also why I've always been sort of gravitating towards like Mahayana metaphysics. Not some of the other ideas of Mahayana, but their metaphysics I consider to be more sophisticated than the Dhamma or Dharma theory of the earlier schools like Theravada that had the Abhidhamma and all these different kinds of ultimate realities all interacting with each other and flashing off and on, and they're all ultimately real. And it's just easier for me to believe that it's all one ultimately. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, perhaps a few words on disease and hell realms. This question was inspired by your Burmese dog stories, but also by my COVID-addled brain, which has been producing weird mental loops. Well, going with Orthodox Buddhism, you can say like figuratively, there are hell realms in this world, like some brothel in Bangkok with teenage village girls sold to the brothel, and they're locked in this room, and they have to be prostitutes regardless of how they feel about the matter. You could call that a kind of hell realm. Like certain street corners in like Baltimore, or there's one famous city, it's just become like a meme where, you know, you'll have people showing videos of just people on drugs, just like zombies, this sort of staggering around or lying on the sidewalk in this city. Or being a Burmese dog can be called a kind of figurative hell realm. One place that I've seen a kind of figurative hell realm was back when I was in my 20s. I got this job. We were going to be working out of Astoria, Oregon. And there was this hotel there. Maybe I shouldn't say the name of the hotel, but it was just a flop house. And we were looking for a place to just kind of, my partner and I were looking for a place to kind of station ourselves, just have like a home base. And so he went there. I went there with him to this hotel. And I mean, it was just scary. It was like, there was a woman there who was cooking food. She had the bridge of her nose was completely flattened out, which just looked like it was a genetic thing. And although later I read that that's one of the symptoms of advanced syphilis, is it flattens out the bridge of your nose, and the whole place just stank. And he got my partner got shown this room. You know, it's like it's $80 a month, but it's $50 a month if you pay cash in advance. And it was just like this bombed out room with this mattress there, there's stains all over it. And it was just the smell, the vibe was like lead in this whole place. And it was like, I just wanted to get out of there as soon as I could. It was not a place where I would want to be just sitting there soaking up these diseased vibes, much less, you know, vapors and pathogens and so forth. And also one little hell realm that I came across when I was in Burma was we were on a road trip somewhere. We were going somewhere down the highway, and it was a highway heading north towards China. And a lot of truckloads of pigs, live pigs, go to China. It's like the Burmese are exporting live pigs to China because the Chinese like their pork. And we stopped at this tea shop because the driver I was with wanted to stop at a tea shop and have some tea. I stayed outside, and one of these truckloads of pigs pulls up. And these pigs, I mean, it's like a little Toyota pickup. And it's just in the back, it's just piled up like 4 deep of live pigs. They're just stacked in there like firewood, and they're all like squealing and screaming. And like the driver of that truck, that little pickup truck, was in having some tea too. Well, these 2 teenage assistants, I've got like bamboo poles, and because the pigs are like squirming, they're like using the bamboo poles to kind of lever them back into being stacked neatly. And I remember going up to them, and the teenage kids, I mean, a Buddhist monk walking up to them when they're like, you know, dealing in livestock for slaughter. You know, they just ignored me. You know, Burmese are pretty good at that sort of thing, just like pretending like they don't see you. And then I'm just saying, this is hell. That is hell right there. But I mean, from a Buddhist point of view, hell is way worse than anything you're gonna find on this planet. It's way worse than a flop house hotel in Astoria, Oregon. Way worse than some drug den. Way worse than a whorehouse. Way worse than a truckload of pigs. I mean, it's just, you know, glowing hot iron and just constant like agony and just misery and torture going on. It's just levels of magnitude, orders of magnitude higher than what you're going to find in this world. You know, maybe the very worst torture chambers in some, you know, autocratic dictatorship, you know, something that Saddam Hussein would have going, or Pol Pot, somebody like that, that might sort of become kind of comparable to some of the higher levels of hell in Buddhism. But yeah, it's really very different. So let's see. Did I answer the question? A few words. Well, I guess I didn't, because I used more than a few. On disease and hell realms. Yeah, disease, I mean, from a Buddhist point of view, it's all a hell realm. You know, even the highest heavens are just the subtlest hell realms. They're the least unpleasant hell realms. It's all dukkha, all the way down. It's not turtles all the way down. It's just dukkha all the way down. So, you got diseases and old age and, getting what you don't want and not getting what you do want and being separated from what you're attached to and all that. That's all dukkha. We're all born screaming. That sort of thing. But, the actual hell realms from a Buddhist point of view are just like way beyond what you're going to find on this planet. So just kind of enjoy that we are in one of the more comfortable hell realms, at least relatively speaking. So let's see here. Going with the 31 planes of existence, human beings are like sixth from the bottom. But that's mainly just because the heaven realms are all divided up into separate realms, whereas the hell realms are all just compacted together, lumped together into one hell realm. But if you divided up the hell realms, we'd be kind of in the middle, humans. Just saying. So I'm just going to move on to Yuga-U. And Yuga-U says, and I don't fully understand this question either. Yuga-U says, I don't see any other way but to look at the women objectively. There is nothing more? Could I be wrong? And which women are the women? It could be the women on the thumbnail of the previous Q&A. That I wanted like beautiful crazy women on the thumbnail of the previous Q&A. And my lovely woman Erin, she did these women that just looked like they didn't look particularly crazy. And I'm saying they should each have a knife. The women should have knives. And she just couldn't get the AI to have beautiful women wielding knives for some reason. I think maybe she was just being stubborn and didn't want to do it or something. She can do that sometimes, occasionally. But, is Yuga-U referring to those women? Or when he cannot, let's see, I don't see any other way but to look at the women objectively. That he's just referring to women in general. He just looks at women objectively. And then there is nothing more. Could I be wrong? Well, if you're looking at anything really objectively, especially women, for a man to look at a woman objectively, I don't know if that's even possible really, because we've got like animal instincts. Like if you even notice whether they're pretty or not, then that's not being entirely objective. Beauty is not an objective thing. It's more subjective. And when you're dealing with women, if you're being completely objective, it's just sort of inconceivable to me that there's always going to be a certain amount of human nature and like human nature conditioned instincts and attitudes that are always going to be in there. Like guys just tend to go easier on women for some reason. They're more polite to women, maybe less likely to yell at a woman. At least most guys. Like there's two women that drive forklifts at work. And neither one of them is like beauty pageant material, but for some reason, they just kind of get a pass that guys don't get. Men are just more kind of lenient towards them. They cut them slack more. And that's not being objective. So, yeah, I'm really not exactly sure what Yuga-U is referring to here and looking at the women objectively. But, if he's human, then I'm kind of skeptical that he's looking at women purely objectively. That there's always going to be a certain amount of human nature creeping in there around the edges that might be subliminal. You don't even fully notice it. But if he's referring specifically to the women on the thumbnail of the previous Q&A, yeah, it kind of went awry a little bit because I wanted crazy women with knives and I just didn't get it. And so it's sort of like fell between two stools. It's like the image was kind of moving in that direction, but not completely, not enough so that it would be a meaningful kind of thumbnail, like symbolizing a theme, which was like beautiful, crazy women in the previous Q&A. So let's see here. I think I'm just going to move on to this question. And what do you know? It's from Erin. And Erin says, when you look at a definition such as intuition, it describes this, quote, the brain draws on past experiences and external cues to make decisions at such high speeds that the response occurs at an unconscious level, unquote. And then Arian says, how would you translate this process through a Buddhist lens? Well, from a Buddhist lens, it would be pretty much everything would be done by intuition, because the process of mind, according to Abhidhamma philosophy, it's like trillions of mind moments, like 17 trillion moments of mind per eye blink. So it's going at such a fast rate that even though it's all volitional and in a sense deliberate, although it's also kind of pushed along by karma, that, you can't really catch it when you're making a quick decision or some such. And even if you're making a slow decision, you're still missing out on 99.999% of what's going on. So it's just kind of more that way if you make a quick decision, which is like the dictionary definition of intuition, where you're drawing on past experiences and external cues and making a decision at such high speeds that the response occurs at an unconscious level or a subconscious level. That's a pretty good description of what's going on in Abhidhamma philosophy all the time. It's like it's happening at trillions of times per second. That there's all this stuff going on that you can't possibly be fully aware of. And so if you're making a relatively quick decision, then it's just going to be more obviously of that sort than if you're making a slow decision in which you're still missing out on almost everything that's going on in like the decision making process and the entire like process of mentality that's going on. So I hope I answered that question, because I'm moving on to Arian's second question, which is there a word for this in Buddhist philosophy that would come close to describing this subconscious process? Well, this is just kind of the way mind works. Chitta Vritti accounts for a lot of it, which is you've got 17 mind moments, and I hope I'm getting the number right, because it's been quite a while since I've studied this kind of stuff. But it's like in quick succession, all in like 1/1,000,000th of a second, every time you've got some mental act, which is, it's happening constantly, that there's these 17 mind moments. You've got like the Bhavanga Chitta, which is a kind of nebulous subconsciousness at first. And then it's like the mind, there's like this agitation, and the Bhavanga starts to wiggle. And then there's like, I don't remember the exact order of everything, but there's all these different mental states that are all like taking place, that are taking part in this one moment of cognition. And then that's followed by another. And it's just like this constant stream of stuff that's happening at 1/17 trillionth of a second each time. So that's just for this one mind moment. It's just this just unthinkably complex series of events supposedly going on according to Abhidhamma philosophy. And then you got karma, which is subconscious, semi-conscious at best, that is sort of it's kind of got the trajectory automatically going, where it would take like a conscious volitional act to kind of move in a different direction from like the direction your karma is pushing you, that kind of a situation. But aside from that, which is just accepted as just the way it is, there's not much more. You've got like the underlying anusyas, which is sort of like latent karma that is always there, that can then kind of be activated under certain circumstances, this kind of thing. But the whole like ancient Indian Buddhist description of human psychology is in some respects radically different from the modern Western understanding of human psychology. So, and ancient Buddhism was pre-Darwinian. So like just why human nature would be the way it is, Abhidhamma just doesn't go there. It just assumes that this is just the way it is due to some cosmic principle or something. some just natural law makes us, be a certain way, and it didn't evolve that way through like natural selection or any such thing. But yeah, I mean, in a way, it's kind of comparing apples to oranges. It's like one paradigm of human psychology and another paradigm of human psychology. You got ancient Indian and modern Western, and they're just not going to fit together very well, just because the beginning assumptions may be radically different. So, in Buddhism, that's pretty much the way your mind always is working. It's just super high speed, one thing after another, going so fast that for the most part, you're oblivious to what's going on. And that's kind of similar to some teachings of Western philosophy, but I don't think there's really a word for it. And because they're just describing how the mind works. It's not like it's some kind of seeming anomaly that needs a special word. It's just chitta or cetasikas or whatever. It's just how the mind works. So I'm sorry if I didn't answer that question completely satisfactorily, and I apologize in advance if I don't answer the next one completely satisfactorily. And this is from Avenity, who is a recent addition to our Discord server. And Avenity says, is there a concept of a witch in the Pali Canon? And interestingly enough, I cannot recall. I assume there's witches in there. I'm just assuming there is. Like at least like in the Dhammapada commentary or some such. But usually like in the suttas, if it's talking about someone who can do like supernatural stuff, they're talking about some swami meditating in a forest. That is just, they don't really talk about witches doing magic. I mean, there is in the Digha Nikaya, the Sila Kanda of the Digha Nikaya, the first several suttas of the Digha Nikaya, there's a list of things that a monk shouldn't do. And one of them is referring to like questioning a girl in trance. Like a spirit medium, essentially. They had spirit mediums where a woman would be like channeling, essentially. And I mean, you could call that a witch, like in the Old Testament, the witch of Endor. When King Saul consults the witch of Endor to communicate with the prophet Samuel, who has already passed away, she's called a witch when really, I mean, she's summoning the dead, through channeling or something. I guess, I mean, she actually did summon his spirit because apparently there was like an apparition there. So, I mean, that kind of witch maybe because there were spirit mediums. They are kind of mentioned very briefly in the Sila Kanda of the Digha Nikaya. I would assume that there's mentions of witches in the Pali Canon that I just don't recall them. At least in the commentarial literature. But clearly in Burma, which is possibly the most Buddhist country in the world, there's a belief in witches, which is sort of like the ancestor veneration. It's not necessarily from the Pali Canon itself. It's just a cultural thing that didn't necessarily come from Theravada Buddhism. But there's a saying in Burma that 1 in every 7 houses houses a witch. That really, there's lots of witches in Burma. They've got lots of beliefs about witches. I was warned about witches that might give me trouble and so forth. I've had like some village woman triumphantly telling me about how some friend of hers got hexed by a witch just recently, which pretty much proves that there's got to be witches, because otherwise, how do you explain this woman getting hexed by a witch if there isn't any witch? So, but most of the mentions, pretty much all of the mentions of some kind of magical stuff going on, supernatural, mental powers, psychic powers, that are mentioned in the Pali Canon, they're referring to like meditators that have developed psychic powers through meditation. So it could be just sort of like a bias in favor of giving a spiritual power to spiritual practitioners and just not attributing that to eccentric females, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, if anyone can recall some specific mention of a witch in the suttas somewhere, then yeah, I mean, I would not at all be surprised But I've heard lots of witch stories when I was living in Burma. I've told a few witch stories, like the guy who snubbed the daughter of some witch and wound up with a wooden shoe in his stomach that had to be surgically removed. And then the day after it was surgically removed, he had another wooden shoe in his stomach. So then they knew it had to be a witch. The doctors knew this. And so they had to call in a Polansia, which is like a white wizard, like a Buddhist, like a virtuous wizard who only does white magic, who had to cure him because the doctors didn't want to just keep cutting it open and removing shoe after shoe. But I mean, that happened in a very Theravada Buddhist country, but I do not recall reading anything specifically about like witches doing magic, like, and members of covens or anything like that in the Pali text, but it could be in there and it wouldn't surprise me. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Seovakshan Sipad Zidana. Let's see, we've been going for a little over 2 hours. That's not too bad. I hope. Seovakshan Sipad Zidana says, you said old age, sickness, and death were overcome by the Buddha because he transcended the meat puppet and realized he ultimately didn't exist. But since there is no self and we were never the meat puppets anyways and already don't ultimately exist, then by this logic, how would you argue against someone who says that we are already free from old age, sickness, and death and just don't realize it? Well, that's what the Mahayana Buddhists say. I mean, ultimately, it's all illusory. It's just that we're wallowing in the illusion. We're clinging to it. We're stuck in the illusion. So, yeah, I got no problem with that. I mean, it's not we are already free from old age because we are part of the illusion. That's part of the thing. So, yeah, I mean, again and again. There are some people who just absolutely cannot deal with two different levels of reality simultaneously. They keep just vehemently, stubbornly, obstinately trying to like compress two different levels of reality into one level. And Theravada Buddhism is guilty of this too. Orthodoxy, like Abhidhamma philosophy, for example. And if you just can't do it, I don't know what to tell you. So, yeah, I mean, if you can just detach from the whole concept of you existing, well, there you go. It doesn't even matter what this supposed meat puppet is undergoing anymore. It becomes essentially irrelevant. So let's see here. Did I come close enough to answering that question that I can just move on to the next one? Let's see. How would you argue against someone who says we are already free from old age, sickness, and death and just don't realize it? Well, you wouldn't use the we are because, I mean, that's part of the illusion too. It's not like there is some we that is free from old age, sickness, and death because the we is what it is that is trapped in old age, sickness, and death. So you have to transcend the we, and so you can't say that we are free from old age, sickness, and death, really. But I mean, it's trying to explain two different levels of reality at the same time. And just, there are some people that just aren't going to be able to go there. But Mahayana Buddhists are saying this all the time. We're all Buddhists. We just don't realize it. Or Eckhart Tolle saying we're already enlightened. It's just that our mind is making so much noise that we don't notice it. That kind of thing. And within that context, I got no argument against it. Just don't try to say that the Buddha taught it. So I'm just going to move on to Seovakshan Sipad Zidana's second question here. What do you think comes first, the destruction of craving or experiencing Nibbana? In the traditional model, you can glimpse Nibbana and even meditate in that state eventually, but that doesn't mean you are an arahant still. Since you don't believe in the stages of enlightenment, I'm curious what your thoughts are on this topic. Well, what about the Four Noble Truths? Third noble truth is the noble truth of cessation, which is it's describing enlightenment. When you no longer have craving, you no longer have suffering, and you are enlightened. Consequently, the cessation of craving and the experiencing of Nibbana would be simultaneous. They would be the same, going with the context of the Four Noble Truths. So you could say that you can temporarily experience Nibbana through a temporary destruction of craving. And I mean, jhanas are called like temporary liberation. So, I mean, you might be able to make some argument about that, but like a real cessation of craving and real enlightenment would be identical. Just going with the Four Noble Truths. So, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, which was the last question yesterday, but then there's a few people snuck in additional questions this morning. So, they're going to be answered today. So anyways, the next question is from Arpad. And Arpad says, from a Theravada viewpoint, is the practice of Nembutsu harmful? And I mean, if you look it up online, what is Nembutsu? It's like calling on the name of Amida Buddha. So, I mean, with that definition of Nembutsu, it's like a Pure Land thing where you're just reciting the name of Amitabha Buddha or Amida Buddha in the hopes of being reborn in his Pure Land. From the Theravada point of view, that would be just wallowing in wrong view. So you'd probably be harming yourself through wrong view, just through what would be considered like a silly belief. But as somebody on the Discord server pointed out, if Nembutsu, the practice of Nembutsu, which is just calling upon the Buddha or a Buddha, I mean, if that's how you interpret it, it's not just restricted to Amitabha or Amida. Then, I mean, if you're using it towards Gautama Buddha, then, I mean, in Thai Buddhism, especially the Thai forest tradition, then just using Buddho or Bhutto as a kind of mantra, then that's a valid meditation technique. And there's a lot of relatively advanced meditation ajahns who would promote just using Buddho, pretty much the way a Hindu would use Om or Ram as a kind of mantra. So, I mean, that wouldn't necessarily be harmful. But calling on Amida Buddha to get you reborn into some Pure Land, then from a Theravada point of view, yeah, that would just be like just this egregious corruption of Dhamma, and the Buddha didn't teach that according to Theravada Buddhism and early Buddhism in general. So it all depends on how you define Nembutsu. If using Nembutsu as calling upon Amida Buddha to get reborn into a Pure Land, his Pure Land, yeah, that would probably be harmful from an Orthodox Theravada point of view, because it would be like wallowing in like a wrong view. Whereas just using Buddho as a mantra, like a meditation object, that wouldn't necessarily be harmful, even though it's not really endorsed in the suttas. But I mean, you know, there are things that are endorsed in the suttas, you know, like Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa, that kind of thing. Using that as a kind of mantra, you could do that. That would be right out of the Pali texts. Just reflection on the qualities of the Buddha, that kind of thing. But the Pure Land stuff, yeah, that definitely would be discouraged from an Orthodox Theravada point of view. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Jules. No, it isn't from Jules. It's from Raphael. And Raphael says, why is Theravada Buddhism still popular in countries like Thailand, Burma, and Sri Lanka, even though it teaches anatta and makes no statements about the state of Nibbana? I mean, the doctrine of anatta is confusing even for many intellectual Buddhists in the West. So how is it for the ordinary population of these countries? Well, I mean, how about the Christian Trinity? I mean, that's just like a koan. That's just some kind of mind bender. Christians don't seem to have a whole lot of problem with it. Even like illiterate peasant villagers in the Middle Ages, you know, they might be, I mean, there was like riots and stuff over like the exact interpretation of the Trinity. You know, it's like, does the Holy Spirit emanate through the Son from the Father, or does it just come directly from the Father? And there was blood flowing in the streets over this kind of stuff. And it was largely people, I mean, they didn't know. They were just following along with their dogma. You know, their teacher said it's this way, so it's this way. And then death to the infidels. So in like Theravada Buddhist countries, they believe in all this doctrinal stuff, but it's just dogma. It's just like words. They don't really understand dependent co-arising. It's one of the most difficult concepts in Buddhism to understand. But they just give it lip service and they'll just repeat like what the commentary says about it. And it's fine. They just assume they're humble. They assume that even though, they might get the general official description or explanation, kind of. Nevertheless, it's the monks, especially the Sayados, who understand it. They have faith that the Sayados understand it, even if they don't fully understand it. And it's the fact that they don't really understand it kind of helps them to have more respect for Dhamma, because Dhamma is so advanced that their simple minds just aren't ready to go there. And so they defer to the monks and prostrate before them and make offerings to them, because the monks understand. At least the simple-hearted villagers believe that. So, anatta, the only Theravada Buddhists that I have encountered that vehemently argue against anatta are Westerners. I never encountered a Burmese Buddhist, arguing against no self. They might not fully understand it. Of course, they don't fully understand it. They don't fully understand a lot of things, but still, it's their religion. They were just born into it. They were taught by their parents. The monks who are wiser than them assure them that it's true, so they have no problem with it. And my nose is kind of plugging up a little bit. So let's see here. I guess I answered that question. I suppose. Just a minute. Just like maybe 2 minutes. I gotta do something. Got to show off my Lithuanian hemp. No, I keep wanting to call it hemp. My Lithuanian linen robe by doing that. So, let's see here. Oh, so there's like follow-up questions to this. Raphael says, are they simply ignorant of this doctrine? No. Just about any educated Burmese villager, and they can be surprisingly knowledgeable with regard to Dhamma, that they know about anatta. That's one of the basic teachings of Buddhism, really. It's one of the 3 marks of existence. So they know about it. They just can't fully grasp it. But in a way, it's like an indication of how exalted the philosophy of Dhamma is, that, they can't grasp it, but they just assume that the Sayados can grasp it, that the Arahants, the wisest Sayados, definitely understand that. It's like Western people and science. The average American doesn't really understand much physics, doesn't understand much chemistry, but they just assume the scientists know. And it doesn't cause them to reject science just because they don't understand the subtle, the subtle teachings of it. So let's see, the next question. Do the monks not even try to explain it to them? Well, the monks themselves, most of them really don't understand it very well. They can just repeat certain teachings. But usually if monks are teaching lay people in Burma, they're teaching them stuff that's suitable for lay people. Especially, you're going to get loads of merit if you make lots of donations to monks. That's like one of the main themes of sermons given by monks in Burma is you're going to get reborn in heaven or as a rich, beautiful human being if you make donations to monks. Wise guy monks just pound away at this theme. But, you can sort of get the idea across to lay people, like the simile of the chariot. It's the simile of the chariot really is not super difficult to understand. You got a chariot, so you take the chariot apart, you've got this pile of parts that came from the chariot. Is that a chariot? Well, not exactly. All the parts of the chariot are still there, but it's not a chariot now. Or you take a chariot, you take off one wheel, put on another wheel. Is it the same chariot? Well, yeah. And so it's like chariot is just a convenient term for a certain assemblage of parts. And then you can apply that to a human being too. It's like your finger gets cut off, God forbid. Are you still you? Well, yeah. You can use the same kind of arguments for a person so that some of the more intelligent, simple-hearted villagers can somewhat get a grasp on it at that level. But there's really not a problem with anatta among like Burmese Buddhist villagers. They might not understand it. They don't understand dependent co-arising either. But, medieval Christian villagers didn't understand the Trinity either, really. Or how the Holy Spirit emanates. Or whether Jesus had one nature or two natures. That kind of thing. So, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Jules. It was a false alarm with the last time I said it was from Jules. But this question really is from Jules. And he said, would reporting an illegal immigrant to ICE break any precepts? And it depends on your mental state. That just reporting an illegal immigrant to the immigration authorities for deportation, presumably, and whether you're doing something wholesome or unwholesome or just neutral depends on your mental states. I mean, if you're doing it out of a hate of Mexicans, for example, then yeah, and then it could be considered a kind of pisuna vacha, which is a kind of wrong speech. Like if you're like bad-mouthing someone behind their back in order to get them into trouble, for example, it's like you're malicious gossip or something. It can even be true. You can be telling the truth, but if your motive is to get that person in trouble, to make trouble for that person by saying some ugly truth about that person to somebody else, then that's still pisuna vacha. It's a kind of wrong speech. It's just like malicious. So if your motives are malicious, you just hate Mexicans or something. And so you're turning in illegal aliens because of that, motivated by just aversion, dosa or whatever, then yeah, you're doing something bad for yourself. And technically that could be considered a violation of the precept against wrong speech. But if you're just like a patriotic American who sincerely believes that anyone living in this country should be here legally, then not necessarily. You're not necessarily like engaging in malicious backbiting or whatever. So let's see. Jules' second question. What about reporting multiple illegal immigrants, dozens hypothetically, leading to the separation of family members? Well, the separation of family members will be irrelevant. It's like, what are your motives? Why are you saying this? And so, I mean, it would just be dozens of times multiplied by the first case, which could or could not, depending on your motives, be a case of wrong speech and thereby a violation of one of the 5 precepts. So whether it results in the separation of family members would be irrelevant from the point of view of Buddhist ethics, unless that's part of your motivation. You hate them so bad you want their families to be separated, let's say. Then that would be part of your malicious motives that would cause you to be violating the precept against wrong speech when you're reporting them. So I think I'm just going to move on to Jules' third question, which is the last question of this entire Q&A. And it is as follows. Have you ever reported an illegal immigrant to ICE? And no, I have not. I don't even know for sure who is an illegal immigrant. I assume there's lots of them in town. But there's a lot of hit and runs, like auto accidents, where you've got probably some Hispanic person who doesn't speak English, hardly or if at all, who get in a wreck or something, and they've got no insurance, no driver's license, anything like that, so they just take off. So you got to be careful about that sort of thing. If you're in South Carolina or pretty much any state, I guess, except for maybe Maine, and you get in some sort of fender bender with someone who doesn't speak English, best thing you can do, immediately take a photograph of their license plate. Just because there's a good chance they're going to take off, or they're going to be begging you in tears, don't report this to the police. whatever it is. And then you're going to wind up just kind of screwed. Maybe your insurance won't cover it or whatever. So, yeah, I don't know anyone in particular who is an illegal immigrant, although I'm sure that there are plenty of them around. So that's it. That's the last question. And I'm going to open my emergency backup beverage just because I feel like it. I've had it here just for this show, and then the show's practically over and I haven't opened it yet. So to hell with it, I'm drinking some. And so, like I should always say at the beginning and never do, except maybe once, if you have any questions you think I can answer, then especially about early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Buddhism in general, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you probably heard all this before. Then feel free to ask no more than 3 questions per episode, please. And there is a chance that soon it may go down from 3 to 2 or even 1, because my woman is like got this idea that several hours every Saturday is really cutting into our weekend free time together. And so maybe we could reduce the number of questions and make the Q&As once every 2 weeks, and then fill in the gaps on alternate weeks with like sutta readings or something. In fact, she especially has been talking about reading stuff that I have written, making videos about it, maybe using AI generated art to illustrate them or something. And I've been trying to get her to do that with a poem that my father wrote. This has been going on for years. And so that may eventually actually start happening. So let's see, like and subscribe. If you haven't already, just smash the hell out of the like button if you liked it. If you didn't, then don't, I guess. And be happy.